And I prayed about it, and I thought, I'm not missing that dedication in Jerusalem without the airplane that we have that I bought from Tyler Perry.
For years, Pastor Kenneth Copeland has stood at the center of a powerful ministry, a huge audience, and a lifestyle that has sparked both admiration and questions. But now, some of the biggest questions surrounding his public image are becoming harder to ignore. What changed behind the scenes? Why are critics paying closer attention? And what does the future really look like for one of America's best-known televangelists? Stay with us because the full story is more complicated than it first appears. Long before Kenneth Copeland became one of the best-known names in American televangelism, his story began in a very different place. Copeland says he entered ministry in 1967. Over the years, his work grew from teaching and preaching into a large media ministry reaching people through television, books, events, and online platforms. But his rise did not happen overnight. Copeland became closely connected with the growing Word of Faith movement. His message focused strongly on faith, healing, prosperity, and the power of believing God's promises. These ideas became central to his public ministry and helped shape the audience that would follow him for decades. As his influence grew, so did the reach of his organization. Kenneth Copeland Ministries became more than a place where sermons were delivered. It developed into a major media operation with television programming, teaching materials, conventions, and other ministry activities. According to the ministry itself, Copeland has been teaching since 1967 and has reached audiences around the world through different forms of media. His wife, Gloria Copeland, also became an important part of that story. The two built their ministry together, with Gloria becoming known for teaching about faith and healing. Their work eventually expanded into television programs, books, meetings, and other resources. For supporters, this growth was proof that Copeland's message was reaching millions of people. But success always brings attention, and Copeland's growing public profile meant that people were no longer looking only at his sermons. They were also looking at the size of his ministry, his public statements, and the way he presented his beliefs. That is where the story begins to change. The bigger his ministry became, the more questions followed. Some people saw him as a powerful teacher who had spent decades spreading his message. Others began to question parts of his teachings and the world surrounding his ministry. This difference in opinion would become one of the most important parts of Copeland's public image. There is another reason his story is especially interesting. Copeland did not simply build a following around one television show or one famous speech. His ministry developed across many platforms, creating a lasting presence that could reach people far beyond a traditional church building. Today, his ministry describes its work as teaching faith, divine healing, biblical prosperity, and related Christian beliefs to people around the world. That reach helped make Kenneth Copeland a major figure in religious broadcasting. But it also created a difficult question. What happens when a preacher becomes bigger than the message itself? That question would follow Copeland for years. And as his ministry grew, the focus would slowly move from how he built his success to the controversies and criticism surrounding that success. That is where the next chapter begins. As Kenneth Copeland's audience grew, his ministry became much more than a television program. It became a large organization built around one central idea. Faith could change the way people lived. Copeland taught a message that placed strong attention on believing God's promises. Faith, healing, success, and prosperity became major themes in his preaching. For many followers, this message offered hope. It told people that their relationship with God could affect every part of their lives. That message found a large audience. Kenneth Copeland Ministries expanded its television work, teaching programs, books, events, and other forms of outreach. Instead of depending on one church building, the ministry could reach people across the United States and around the world. And that changed Copeland's position in the world of televangelism. He was no longer simply a preacher speaking to a local audience. He had become a major religious media figure. But there was something else happening at the same time. The more visible Copeland became, the more closely people began watching his message and lifestyle. His ministry's teachings about prosperity became especially important. Supporters saw prosperity teaching as a message of faith and blessing. They believed that Christians did not have to live without hope or expectation. Critics, however, questioned whether the idea could place too much attention on money and material success. That disagreement would become one of the biggest debates surrounding Copeland. And it was not just about what he preached. It was also about what people believed his success represented. For supporters, the growth of Kenneth Copeland Ministries showed that the message was working. They saw decades of television broadcasting, international outreach, books, conferences, and teaching as evidence of a ministry that had reached an enormous audience. For critics, however, the same success raised uncomfortable questions. How much wealth should a religious leader have? Where should the line be drawn between ministry and personal lifestyle? And when a preacher teaches about prosperity, how should the public judge the wealth connected to that message? These questions became especially powerful because Copeland was not a private religious figure. His name was everywhere. He appeared on television. His teachings were distributed through books and other media. His ministry organized major events. His audience could hear his message without ever stepping inside his church. That meant criticism could spread just as easily as his teachings. One of the most controversial parts of Copeland's public image has involved his use of private aircraft. Copeland has defended the ministry's use of aircraft by arguing that private planes can help ministers travel efficiently and avoid situations that could interfere with ministry work. His ministry has also explained that aircraft are used for ministry-related travel. But critics have viewed the subject very differently. For them, private aviation became a symbol of a much larger concern. Whether a religious leader who teaches about faith and prosperity should live a lifestyle that appears far removed from ordinary believers. And that debate was not going away. In fact, it helped create a pattern that would follow Copeland throughout his career. The more his ministry grew, the more people asked questions about the relationship between faith, money, influence, and lifestyle. Still, it would be unfair to tell the story as if everyone turned against him. That simply did not happen. Copeland continued to have loyal supporters who believed strongly in his teachings. Many people continued to watch his programs, attend ministry events, read his material, and support his work. That is an important part of understanding his story. Kenneth Copeland's influence did not disappear simply because criticism increased. In many ways, the criticism made his public image even more complicated. He became a figure who could inspire deep loyalty among supporters while also attracting strong criticism from people who disagreed with his teachings. And that brings us to the real question behind this documentary. Is Kenneth Copeland's ministry actually in trouble? Or is the phrase "things aren't looking good" based more on criticism, changing public attitudes, and the growing pressure placed on high-profile religious leaders? To answer that, we have to look beyond the headlines. Because the most important part of the story is not simply that Copeland has critics. He has had those for years. The bigger question is what those criticisms reveal about the challenges facing his ministry today. And that is where things start getting much more complicated. For decades, Kenneth Copeland has built his public image around faith, healing, prosperity, and confidence in God. But the same message that attracted millions of followers also created some of the biggest questions about his ministry. At the center of the debate is the idea of prosperity. Copeland and other Word of Faith teachers have often taught that faith can bring blessings into a person's life. Supporters may see this as a message of hope. They believe God wants people to trust Him and expect His help. Critics see the message differently. They argue that religious teaching should not connect faith so closely with financial success or material wealth. And this disagreement is important because it is not simply a debate about one preacher. It is a much bigger debate about what people expect from religious leaders. Should a preacher live simply? Can a successful ministry have expensive buildings, private aircraft, and large events? And if a ministry receives donations from supporters, how should that money be used? These questions have followed Copeland for years. One of the most visible examples has been his use of private aircraft. Copeland has explained that private aviation can make ministry travel easier and help avoid delays that could affect his schedule. His ministry has also described aircraft as tools for ministry travel. But the public reaction has often been divided. To supporters, the planes can be viewed as practical tools. To critics, they can look like symbols of wealth. That difference in interpretation is one reason Copeland remains such a controversial figure. The discussion becomes even more complicated when the subject moves from travel to lifestyle. A celebrity preacher does not live under the same level of public attention as an ordinary church leader. When a religious figure becomes famous, everything can become part of the public conversation. The house, the cars, the planes, the clothing, the way money is discussed. Even the words used during a sermon can be examined by millions of people. And Copeland has been in that spotlight for a very long time. This does not mean every criticism against him is automatically true. That is an important distinction. A criticism is not the same thing as proof. A claim made online is not automatically a fact. And a controversial opinion should not be presented as established truth. But the fact that these questions continue to appear tells us something important about Copeland's public image. People are interested not only in what he teaches, they are interested in whether his lifestyle matches the message he teaches. That is where the story becomes personal. Religious leaders often ask their followers to trust them. When that trust is strong, followers may defend them when criticism appears. But when trust becomes weaker, the same criticism can feel much more serious. This is one reason public perception matters so much. Copeland has built a ministry that depends heavily on communication. His teachings reach people through television, online content, books, events, and other forms of media. That gives him a powerful way to speak directly to supporters. But it also means that controversial moments can spread quickly. A short clip from an older sermon can suddenly reach a new audience. A statement from years ago can be discussed as if it happened yesterday. And an old controversy can return whenever people begin questioning a public figure again. This creates a difficult environment for someone with such a long career. Copeland is not a new preacher trying to build an audience. He has been part of American religious broadcasting for decades. That means his public record is enormous. There are years of sermons, interviews, ministry programs, books, events, and public statements. Supporters can point to decades of ministry work. Critics can point to decades of controversial statements. Both sides can find material to support their view. And that may be the most interesting part of the entire story. Kenneth Copeland's reputation is not built around one simple idea. To some people, he is a successful Christian teacher who has dedicated his life to spreading his interpretation of faith. To others, he represents the problems they see in prosperity preaching and celebrity-style religion. Neither description tells the whole story by itself. The truth is more complicated. And then there is the question that has become harder to avoid as time passes. Can a ministry built around one extremely recognizable leader remain just as powerful when public trust begins to change? That question matters because religious movements can depend heavily on personality. When people connect strongly with a leader, the leader becomes part of the brand. That can be a strength, but it can also become a weakness. If the public image of the leader changes, the entire organization may feel the effect. This is where Copeland's story moves from past controversy to present pressure. The debate is no longer only about what he taught years ago. It is also about how people view him now. And as public attitudes toward wealthy religious leaders continue to change, the pressure on Copeland has become harder to ignore. But criticism alone does not tell us whether his ministry is actually declining. For that, we need to look at what happened when the public spotlight became even brighter, and when some of the biggest questions about Copeland's ministry reached audiences far beyond his usual followers. That is when the story took another turn. Kenneth Copeland had already faced criticism for years, but the digital age changed the way that criticism traveled. In the past, a controversial statement might appear in a newspaper, a television report, or a magazine. Now, one short video can reach millions of people. That changed everything. Old clips can suddenly become popular again. Interviews can be shared across social media. People who have never watched a full sermon can see a few seconds and form an opinion. For a public figure like Copeland, that creates a serious challenge. His career stretches across decades, which means there is a huge amount of material for people to examine. and some of that material has become controversial. One of the biggest areas of criticism has remained his teachings about prosperity. Critics have argued that prosperity preaching can create unrealistic expectations for people who are struggling financially. They question the idea that faith should be closely connected to wealth or material success. Supporters reject that interpretation. They argue that the message is about trusting God, not simply chasing money. This disagreement has never been completely settled. And because Copeland has remained one of the most recognizable figures connected to the movement, he has often become a symbol of the larger debate. But money is only one part of the story. Another issue is trust. When people donate money to a religious organization, they want to believe that their support is being used responsibly. That expectation becomes even stronger when the organization is connected to a famous preacher. This is why questions about ministry finances can become so sensitive. People are not only asking about numbers, they are asking about values. They want to know whether the lifestyle they see matches the message they hear. And this is where Copeland's private aircraft became such a powerful symbol. The aircraft issue has been discussed publicly for years. Copeland has defended the use of private planes for ministry travel, while critics have questioned whether such an expensive form of transportation is appropriate for a religious leader. The disagreement is not simply about airplanes. It represents a larger argument about what religious leadership should look like. One person may see a tool that helps a busy preacher travel. Another may see unnecessary luxury. The same object can create two completely different stories depending on who is looking at it. That is one reason Copeland's public image is so divided. His supporters can point to the size and reach of his ministry. His critics can point to the controversies that have followed him. And social media has made the gap between those two groups even wider. But there is another factor that cannot be ignored. Copeland has been working in public ministry for a very long time. That means age itself becomes part of the conversation. A younger preacher can build a new identity online. A longtime televangelist has to manage decades of history. Every old controversy can return. Every old clip can be rediscovered. Every statement can be judged by a new generation with completely different expectations. That can be difficult for any public figure. It is especially difficult for someone whose career was built before social media existed. The audience has changed. The media has changed. The way people judge public figures has changed. And religious broadcasting has changed too. People no longer have to wait for a television program to come on at a certain time. They can search for sermons instantly. They can watch clips on their phones. They can compare different preachers. They can hear critics respond immediately. That means a ministry has less control over the story surrounding its leader. And this is one of the biggest challenges facing high-profile religious organizations today. The official message is only one part of the conversation. The audience creates its own conversation. For Copeland, that conversation can be supportive one moment and deeply critical the next. Still, there is an important point that often gets lost in dramatic headlines. Criticism does not automatically mean collapse. A controversial public figure can remain highly influential. A ministry can face negative attention and still have loyal supporters. And an organization can change its communication strategy without disappearing. So, when someone says that things aren't looking good for Kenneth Copeland, the real question is, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean his ministry is disappearing? Does it mean his influence is shrinking? Does it mean younger audiences are less interested? Or does it simply mean that criticism is louder than it used to be? Those are very different things. And without evidence, it would be wrong to claim that one of them is definitely happening. What we can say is that Copeland operates in a much different media environment than the one in which he first became famous. The rules have changed, the audience has changed, and public expectations have changed. For a preacher whose career has lasted for decades, adapting to those changes may be one of his biggest challenges yet. But there is still one major question left. After all the controversy, criticism, debates about wealth, and changes in media, what does Kenneth Copeland's ministry actually look like now? And more importantly, what could happen to his legacy in the years ahead? That is where the story becomes even more interesting. After decades in the public eye, Kenneth Copeland's story has reached a point where the biggest question is no longer simply about controversy. It is about the future. Copeland has built a ministry that has lasted for generations. That is not easy to do. Religious trends change. Media changes. Audiences change. Yet Kenneth Copeland Ministries has continued to operate across television, digital media, teaching programs, books, events, and other forms of outreach. That does not look like an organization that simply disappeared. But survival and influence are not exactly the same thing. The media world that helped make Copeland famous has changed dramatically. Television is no longer the only way people discover religious teachers. Younger viewers often find content through YouTube, social media, podcasts, and short-form video. That means today's religious leaders have to compete for attention in a completely different environment. For Copeland, this creates both an opportunity and a challenge. His ministry already has a huge library of material. Decades of sermons and teachings can be shared online. Older messages can reach people who were not even alive when they were first recorded. At the same time, the internet makes it much easier for viewers to question what they hear. People can search for another opinion within seconds. They can watch critics. They can compare teachings. They can look at old interviews. They can discuss controversies in public. The audience is no longer simply receiving the message. The audience is also part of the conversation. That shift matters because Copeland's public image has always been connected to trust. His followers have to believe that his message is worth listening to. But public trust can be difficult to maintain when a leader becomes the subject of repeated controversy. This does not mean every criticism is true. It also does not mean every supporter is wrong. The situation is more complicated. Copeland has people who strongly believe in his teachings. There are also people who strongly disagree with him. And there is a large group of viewers who may not know what to believe. That middle group can be especially important. They may hear one side of the story and then search for the other. They may see a viral clip and want to understand the full context. They may wonder why Copeland has remained successful despite decades of criticism. And that brings us back to one of the strongest parts of his story. He has built a very loyal audience. Loyalty can protect a public figure from criticism because supporters do not necessarily judge the leader in the same way as outsiders. A critic might see wealth and ask, "How can this be acceptable for a preacher?" A supporter might see the same thing and ask, "What has this ministry accomplished?" The answer depends heavily on the person's starting point. That is why arguments about Copeland rarely end with everyone agreeing. People are not only debating facts. They are often debating values. What should a Christian leader look like? What should a successful ministry be allowed to own? How should religious donations be handled? What does prosperity mean in Christianity? And how much wealth is too much for someone who teaches faith? These are difficult questions, and they go far beyond Kenneth Copeland himself. They are part of a much larger debate about celebrity culture and religion. Copeland simply happens to be one of the most recognizable names in that debate. There is also another issue that becomes more important with time: succession. Any long-running organization eventually has to think about what happens after its most recognizable leader is no longer at the center. Copeland has spent decades building the ministry and becoming closely associated with its identity. That can be powerful, but it can also create a challenge. Can an organization built around one famous personality remain just as strong when the personality changes? That question does not necessarily mean something is wrong with the ministry today. It is simply a natural question for any organization with a long history, and the answer may depend on how well the ministry can pass its message to a new generation. If younger audiences connect with the teachings, the organization may continue to evolve. If they do not, the ministry may face a very different future. That is why the next stage of Copeland's story may be less about his past and more about adaptation. Can the ministry speak to people who consume information differently? Can it maintain the trust of longtime supporters? Can it explain controversial subjects clearly? And can it remain relevant while religious culture continues to change? Those questions may matter more than any single headline. Because one thing is clear: Kenneth Copeland is not simply a preacher with a television program. He represents an entire style of religious broadcasting that has been debated for decades. His supporters see a lasting ministry. His critics see a symbol of problems they believe exist within prosperity preaching. And the public continues to watch. So, are things really not looking good for Kenneth Copeland? The answer is not as simple as a dramatic headline suggests. There are real criticisms. There are real questions. There are also real supporters and a ministry that continues to operate. The more interesting question may be what happens next. Because the final chapter of this story may not be about whether Kenneth Copeland disappears. It may be about whether his influence can survive the changing world around him. After everything we have seen, one thing is clear. Kenneth Copeland's story cannot be reduced to one headline. For decades, he has built a powerful religious media presence, attracted a large audience, and become one of the most recognizable names in American televangelism. At the same time, his success has brought serious questions. His teachings about prosperity have been debated. His lifestyle has been examined. His use of private aircraft has attracted criticism. And his public image has become a constant subject of discussion. But controversy does not automatically erase influence. In fact, Copeland's long career shows how powerful a loyal audience can be. People who believe in his message may continue watching and supporting his ministry even when others strongly disagree with him. And that is why the future of Kenneth Copeland Ministries may depend on something bigger than criticism. It may depend on whether the organization can continue connecting with new generations. The world of media is changing quickly. People watch content on phones. They discover ideas through short videos. They listen to podcasts. They search for answers online. And they can challenge a public figure's claims almost instantly. That means the next stage of Copeland's legacy will exist in an environment that is very different from the one in which he became famous. If his ministry can adapt while keeping the message that its supporters value, it may continue for many years. But if younger audiences stop connecting with that message, the organization could face a very different challenge. That is the real test. Not whether one controversy disappears, not whether every critic changes their mind, but whether the message can remain meaningful when the audience changes. And there is something else worth remembering. Kenneth Copeland's story is still part of a much larger conversation about religion, money, fame, and influence. His career raises questions that go beyond one person. How should religious leaders handle wealth? How much influence should a preacher have? Where is the line between ministry and celebrity? And when followers trust a leader, what responsibility comes with that trust? These questions will continue long after one news cycle ends. For some viewers, Copeland will remain a respected teacher. For others, he will remain a controversial symbol of prosperity preaching. And for many people, the truth may feel somewhere in between. That is what makes his story so complicated. So when we hear the words, "Things aren't looking good for Pastor Kenneth Copeland," we should ask a better question, not just what is going wrong, but what happens next. Because a career that has lasted this long does not disappear because of a few headlines. Its future depends on trust, relevance, leadership, and the ability to connect with people in a changing world. Kenneth Copeland has already left a major mark on American religious broadcasting. The question now is how that mark will be remembered. Will future generations see him mainly as a powerful preacher who built a worldwide ministry? Will they remember the controversies that surrounded his wealth and teachings? Or will his legacy become a mixture of both? Only time can answer that. But one thing is certain. The story of Kenneth Copeland is far from simple. And perhaps that is why people continue to watch, question, support, and debate him after all these years. If you found this story interesting, subscribe for more deep celebrity and public figure documentaries. And if you want to see another story like this, stay with us, because there is always more behind the headlines.